We know Vikings as raiders and warriors. What we don't talk about is what happened inside their own homes. When the raids ended and the shields were hung on the walls, the real horror began. Not for the warriors. Their battles were over. For their wives, for the women they called their own, the nightmare never stopped. What Vikings did to their wives makes death look like mercy. You think you know Viking brutality? The sagas barely whisper what came next. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which country you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using law codes, chronicles, and archaeological evidence from Viking sites. Now, back to the story. 872, Iceland was one of the only places in medieval Europe where a wife could legally divorce her husband. At first glance, it sounds progressive, almost modern. But the law turned freedom into humiliation. The Grágás law code required a wife to follow a ritual. First, she had to stand at the side of the marriage bed and announce her separation out loud, as if speaking to the ghosts of the union. Then, she walked to the front doorway and repeated it so her neighbors could hear. And finally, she stood before the entire assembly, her family, her husband's kin, rivals, strangers, and declared her marriage broken. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't private. It was a spectacle. Her reputation burned to ash before she ever stepped out of that house. The sagas tell of women who dared. Some, like Hallgrímur in Njáls saga, became infamous, remembered for their defiance. But most vanished from history, erased like property notes on rune sticks. Archaeologists in Iceland have found carved wooden records from these farmsteads. Some appear to show women's names listed beside livestock and tools, as if they were simply another asset. A divorce meant her name shifted hands, the same way one might mark the transfer of a cow. So yes, a Viking wife could leave. But the cost was dignity, property, kinship ties, and sometimes survival itself. But here's the twist. That humiliation was mercy, because what came next for many wives was far worse. 880. Across Norway, archaeologists uncovered graves that tell a story the sagas tried to hide. Buried in shallow soil near Viking farmsteads, women's skeletons bore wounds that had nothing to do with battle. One woman's skull shows signs of being smashed in by a heavy blow. Another's forearm showed fractures that matched the pattern of someone raising a hand to block repeated blows. Several rib cages were broken in clusters, not by swords or spears, but by fists, clubs, or kicks delivered inside the longhouse. These weren't battlefield wounds. These were the hidden wars of marriage. The sagas whisper of men striking wives for defiance. Njáls saga mentions a wife who was beaten into silence by her husband. But here's the truly horrifying part. Archaeological evidence showed healed fractures, rebroken years later, proof of violence repeated again and again. Imagine it. The smoky warmth of the longhouse, children huddled by the hearth, and the sound of bone cracking under a husband's fist. For Viking wives, the family hearth was not safety. It was a battlefield they could never win. Marriage wasn't protection. It was captivity, and the bones still carry their bruises. 891. The Viking law was blunt. A man could keep concubines, known as frilla, and his wife had no power to refuse. Picture the humiliation. You are the wife, the keeper of the longhouse, the woman who spins, weaves, cooks, and raises the children. Then your husband brings another woman into your home. She doesn't hide in shame. She eats at your table. She sleeps under your roof. And at night, she climbs into the same bed. The sagas recorded the rage it caused. In Laxdæla saga, Gudrun is forced to share her household with her husband's mistress. But protest was dangerous. A wife who resisted could be beaten, cast out, or divorced without her dowry. Archaeology puts flesh to the story. At Birka in Sweden, excavations revealed female burials beside one man, which may reflect such household arrangements. Isotope analysis showed they weren't kin, but they shared the same household. Wife and concubine, rivals in life, companions in death. This wasn't private betrayal. It was public, legal, and irreversible. And concubines were not the worst fate for a wife. What came next was darker. 902. Viking marriages weren't love stories, they were business contracts. The sagas speak of weddings as alliances, sealed with feasting and silver. But behind the songs, the truth was brutal. Daughters were bargaining chips. Wives were traded like cattle, their futures decided by male relatives long before the wedding feast. The ceremony was silence. The bride never spoke her vows. Her father or uncle did it for her. The law didn't care about her voice, only about her value. Archaeology from Dublin suggests carved wooden tablets recorded property. Some may even include women's names alongside livestock and land. She was accounted for as if she were another piece of property being transferred. The morning after came the morgengjöf, the morning gift. Jewelry, land, or silver given to the wife. But this wasn't a token of love, it was proof of purchase, a receipt that the marriage had been consummated. For Viking wives, the wedding wasn't the start of a new life, it was the end of choice. 921. On the banks of the Volga River, an Arab traveler named Ibn Fadlan watched a Viking funeral. He recorded what no saga dared. A wealthy chieftain had died. His ship was prepared, his weapons laid beside him, and his servants gathered to mourn. But he would not sail into the afterlife alone. A girl was chosen to follow him. Fadlan describes the horror. First, she was plied with drink. Then she was drugged with henbane, a hallucinogenic seed that made her compliant and confused. Afterward, she was paraded through the camp, forced to endure ritual intercourse with the men, an honor for the dead. And finally, she was strangled with a rope, stabbed, and laid beside her master on the pyre as flames consumed the ship. Archaeology confirms the testimony. Female skeletons, found in ship burials at Oseberg and Kaupang, show strangulation marks on vertebrae, traces of poison in their teeth, even bone cuts suggesting ritual stabbing. Imagine it. Your husband dies, and instead of mourning, the community chooses you to burn alive beside him. For Viking wives, even death was not their own. It wasn't mercy, it was sacrifice. 930. In the trash heaps of Viking settlements, archaeologists discovered bones that sagas never mentioned. Infant skeletons tossed aside like rubbish. Tiny skulls fractured by blunt force. Ribs snapped in ways that no childbirth could explain. These weren't accidents, these weren't stillbirths. They were deliberate killings. The law was clear. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. If the mother was a concubine, the child's status depended on the father's will. And if the child could not be raised to work, it was discarded. At Hedeby, the largest Viking port, archaeologists found infant bones mixed with animal waste. At Dublin, soil samples revealed dozens of newborns buried shallow, their tiny bones stained with iron from blunt trauma. For Viking wives, this meant more than grief. It meant terror. A mother could carry a child for 9 months, only to have it taken from her arms and silenced forever. The sagas are silent on this horror, but the bones scream the truth. 947. Viking law codes left no doubt. A wife was property. The Gulething law from Norway spelled it out. A husband had authority over his wife's body, wealth, and even her life. If she committed adultery, he could kill her without punishment. But if she raised a hand against him, her family paid silver fines or faced outlawry. Archaeology at Hedeby revealed iron collars and ankle rings. Some belonged to slaves, but others were buried with wealthy grave goods, suggesting they marked wives too. Women shackled not by chains, but by law. Runic inscriptions confirm it. Inheritance stones listed women beside oxen and sheep. 1 wife, 2 cows, 4 fields. Their names reduced to inventory. The sagas sometimes celebrate strong women who argued in assemblies, but the law cut their voices short. In practice, a Viking wife had no more rights than a sword or a plow. Her body was her husband's. Her fate, his to decide. 962. In York, Jorvik to the Norse, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a building that rewrote Viking history. It had 64 chambers, each fitted with iron rings sunk deep into the stone. At first, historians thought it was a prison. But the soil told another story. Bone fragments of women, infant remains by the dozens, signs of repeated pregnancies, mothers used until their bodies failed, children dying before their 5th birthday. Church records filled the silence. York Minster baptism rolls listed 732 children as foundlings. Only 12 survived to adulthood. The others vanished from the record, or from life. Account books show money flowing from these facilities to church construction projects, cathedrals built on women's suffering. Imagine walking through York in the 10th century. In the city center stood a hall everyone knew, a place where women's lives were measured in births and deaths. The sagas say nothing. The stones never forgot. 986. At Repton in England, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave sealed for centuries. 236 bodies, all female. Isotope analysis revealed they weren't foreign captives. They were Norse-born, wives and daughters. When Viking power collapsed in England, men turned their axes inward. Better to kill their own wives than let them be taken. The methods were brutal. Strangulation with ropes, blunt trauma to the skull, poison from herbs. One skull carried a runic inscription carved after death. 3 words in Old Norse, better this way. It belonged to a girl no older than 14, born in Norway, brought to England as a child and killed by her own family. Imagine the scene, fathers killing daughters, husbands killing wives, not in rage, but as a mercy twisted by fear. The chronicles are silent, the sagas are silent. But the grave spoke. 1014. The sagas praise Viking kings for forging peace through marriage, but peace for kingdoms meant pain for wives. At Dublin, marriage contracts were carved into stone tablets, not vows of love, lists of livestock, silver, and fields. And at the bottom, the bride's name, written like another piece of currency. One chronicle records a Norse warlord's marriage to an Irish princess. Her brothers celebrated the union of kingdoms. She remained silent. Archaeology at Dublin's Wood Quay uncovered fragments of these property tablets. Side by side, oxen, sheep, and women's names. The morning after came the morgengjöf, the morning gift. But this wasn't romance, it was proof of purchase. For Viking wives, peace wasn't safety, it was another kind of war. 1066. Harold Godwinson died at Hastings. England belonged to the Normans. The chronicles praise William's knights for civilizing the Saxon bloodline. But beneath the words, the practices were the same as Viking custom. Conquered Saxon wives were taken, forced into marriages with Norman lords. Resistance was treason. The Domesday Book, England's great survey, lists women as part of property inventories, alongside grain stores and livestock. Archaeology at Norman castles revealed holding cells designed specifically for women. Thick stone walls, iron doors, no windows. Some held 30 women at a time. Bones found in castle middens tell the rest. Infant mortality rates near 100%. Mixed blood children weren't raised, they were erased. The conquest wasn't a fresh start. It was Viking brutality, repackaged with a new name. 1100. Centuries passed, chronicles grew silent. The sagas turned brutal reality into legend. But DNA doesn't lie. Modern studies reveal the truth. Icelandic women carry 60% Celtic ancestry. Norwegians, nearly half from the British Isles. These weren't peaceful migrations. They were women carried across seas in chains. Their bloodlines endured. Their names did not. The Vikings tried to silence their wives, but genetics gave them the last word. 1130. Archaeologists in York uncovered a hall with 64 cells, each fitted with chains. It wasn't a prison, it wasn't storage, it was industry. Soil analysis revealed decades of occupation. Women kept alive until their bodies failed. Infants buried shallow, generation after generation. Church baptismal records list 732 children born in this facility. Only 12 lived past the age of 5. The rest died unnamed. Account books from York Minster show regular payments from the hall to church treasuries. Cathedrals and chapels built with blood money. God's house raised on women's suffering. The sagas may stay silent, but the stones never forgot. For Viking wives, marriage wasn't safety, and sometimes the only escape was death itself. But what about the women dragged from burning villages, chained and sold like livestock? Their story makes even this one look merciful. Click right here. The answer is worse than anything you've heard so far.